The Missouri Compromise.
There was a bitter debate over Missouri's admission into the Union for 4 months in the winter of 1819. The North, led by Rufus King, believed that Congress could decide whether slavery was allowed in a new state, while the South, led by William Pinckney, argued that the state should have the right to choose freedom or slavery like the 13 original colonies. Congress wanted to diffuse tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise was passed in 1820. The compromise was developed by Henry Clay, who was known as the Great Compromise. It allowed Maine to enter as a free state and Missouri to be admitted as a slave state. There was also an amendment passed that drew a line across Louisiana Territory, dividing free and slave states, and also prohibiting slavery north of the 3630 line. The original purpose of the compromise was to keep a balance between the number of free states and slave states in the Union. However, the South criticized the idea that Congress now had the power to make laws on the issue of slavery.
Frederick Douglass and the North Star.
Frederick Douglass was a leader in the abolitionist movement and was born in Maryland. Douglass wrote an autobiography in 1845 titled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. In his writing, he vividly described the tortures he faced as a slave for 5 years in Maryland. After separation from his mother as a child, Douglass goes on to turn his life around by learning to read and write in Baltimore. This skill allowed him not only to write his autobiography, but also to start an abolitionist newspaper. The North Star was an anti-slavery paper published in Rochester, New York by Frederick Douglass. The paper's name was developed from the idea that slaves who escaped at night followed the North Star to freedom. Douglass's newspaper became the most influential mechanism of the anti-slavery movement in the antebellum era. Douglass's efforts were extremely important to the eventual abolition of slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. In response to the continuation and spread of slavery in Southern territories prompted by the Missouri Compromise, Douglass, among many other individuals, worked diligently to free many suffering slaves. In fact, Douglass wrote on November 24, 1854, in his paper about the newly repealed Missouri Compromise. Douglass wrote, "The proposition to repeal the Missouri Compromise was a stunning one. It fell upon the nation like a bolt from a cloudless sky. The thing was too startling for belief. You believed in the South, and you believed in the North, and you knew the repeal of the Missouri Compromise was a breach of honor." This emphasizes how Douglass used his voice to spread abolitionist views on political issues that were spreading at the time.
Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Two of the most impactful abolitionists were Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published her most famous work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This anti-slavery novel followed the life of a slave and had a profound effect on attitudes towards African Americans and slavery in the U.S. It is said to have helped lay the groundwork for the Civil War, as it was the best-selling novel of the century. This novel heavily contributed to a new wave of abolitionist ideology in the U.S., which contributed to increased regional tensions. Frederick Douglass and Stowe's works complement each other very well, as he even notoriously praised her for the novel in his newspaper, The North Star.
The Emancipation Proclamation.
Uncle Tom's Cabin contributed to an increasing wave of abolitionist ideology in the North. This abolitionist ideology influenced Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves within the rebellious states. The Emancipation Proclamation, or Proclamation 95, was a presidential proclamation and executive order issued by the United States President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, during the third year of the Civil War. It changed the federal legal status of more than 3.5 million enslaved African Americans in the designated areas of the South from slave to free.
Many of the slaves that were freed in the South came north and joined the Union Army. This made the North even more powerful and arguably helped them to finally win the war. Lincoln's assassination.
The Emancipation Proclamation changed the course of the American Civil War. Prior, Lincoln's goal was solely to maintain the Union. When the proclamation was signed, it signified that ending slavery was a goal of the Union as well. Many Southerners felt threatened by this, as their economy relied on slave labor. The South saw the proclamation as vindication for their rebellion, especially since freed blacks served in the Union Army. This increased the size of the Union Army and gave them a military advantage. John Wilkes Booth, who was Lincoln's assassin, was an outspoken Confederate who aimed to avenge the Confederate cause and rally support. Angered by Lincoln's speech to grant voting rights to African Americans and his abolitionist tendencies, such as the Emancipation Proclamation, John Wilkes Booth, Lewis Powell, and David Harold conspired against three important officials of the U.S. government, namely Secretary of State William H. Seward, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and of course, Abraham Lincoln. However, the plot failed beyond Lincoln, as Seward was merely wounded and the shooter who was supposed to assassinate Johnson opted out. On April 14th, Booth learned that Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant were going to see Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater that night. Since Booth had performed there before, he knew the layout of the theater, which served to his advantage. Lincoln's bodyguards were unavailable to attend the play, so policeman John Friedrich Parker was assigned to guard the box. He went to a nearby tavern during intermission, allowing Booth to easily enter the president's box. Since Booth knew the play by heart, he waited until the actor Harry Hawk said his famously funny line to shoot Lincoln. It is said that Lincoln was laughing when he was shot.
He's getting away.
Revenge for the South.
Lincoln was taken to the tailor William Peterson's house next door, where many physicians arrived, including Lincoln's personal doctor. Each one declared the gunshot final. Lincoln died on April 15th at 7:22 in the morning.
Black codes.
After Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, his vice president Andrew Johnson became president. Since Johnson was a Southerner, he wanted to readmit the Southern states to the Union quickly. Johnson appointed military governors to lead the former Confederate states, and each governor held full power until new civilian governments could be formed. White Southerners wanted to restore self-rule, so they held elections under new state constitutions. Oftentimes, this resulted in ex-Confederate leaders becoming state governors or congressmen. These ex-Confederates passed many laws that limited the freedom of former slaves. In fact, these laws did not differ from those passed during the colonial times. The legislators felt little reason to stop their unequal treatment of African Americans. In an editorial in a Georgia newspaper, an editor wrote, "There is such a racial difference in the mental and moral nature of the white and black race that it would be impossible to secure order in a mixed community by the same law." Additionally, white Southerners feared that if African Americans did not work for the white landowners, the Southern agricultural economy would collapse. These fears and prejudices resulted in the first Black Codes of 1865. These codes were comprised of laws unique to African Americans, and they restricted African Americans' rights to vote, serve on juries, travel freely, or work in occupations of their choice. The first Black Code, which was produced by Mississippi, was harsh and vengeful. Following that, South Carolina enacted a Black Code which was slightly less strict but more comprehensive in regulating the lives of African Americans. In fact, it was aimed at anyone with more than 1/8 of what they called black blood. The Black Codes highlighted the white tendency to control former slaves. They sparked much controversy in the North, which thought that the South was trying to restore slavery. The original Black Codes never went into effect. The Union governors and the Freedmen's Bureau immediately nullified them, so South Carolina and Mississippi revised them. In 1866, the revised Black Codes went into effect, but they paid more attention to the legal equality that existed between blacks and whites. The Black Codes returned again in the 1890s, known as the Jim Crow laws. These laws made it illegal for blacks and whites to share public facilities, and the Jim Crow laws actually remained in effect until the 1950s and 1960s. Had Lincoln never been assassinated, Johnson may have never assumed presidency and triggered the passing of such demeaning laws.
The era of Reconstruction.
All of these events regarding slavery led to the period of Reconstruction, which took place from 1865 to 1877, during which politicians attempted to compensate for the injustices of slavery and solve the problems that accompanied readmitting the Confederate States back into the Union. Reconstruction was a period of large political and constitutional changes. Lincoln had announced his first plan for Reconstruction less than a year after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. After Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson became president, he initiated the period of presidential Reconstruction. As previously mentioned, his policies proved ineffective when the Black Codes were established and inequality prevailed.